Awesome. Cool. All right. Cool. All right. So yeah, I was asked to present on this article written by uh, Geronimo Castro. He's actually a Brazilian comrade. So we had our comments translated, but we didn't actually write it. We thought it was a pretty good article that's summarizing. First it goes over the categories of what it tries to summarize what Marx and Engels have written on the state, the difference between regime, government, and such, and then it goes into how it fits into fascism. So yeah, so the first part of this article go over into just a basic definition of the state. So goes over that the states hasn't always existed. It originated when societies started having a surplus. So once there was enough resources, whether that's agricultural things like that, and then there was a needed to be it started creating conflict and a fight for that surplus of money. So yeah, so the state arises from this, and then the first state societies, they needed to defend this surplus of things. So that's when they started creating one of the key aspects of a state, which is having some kind of armed force. So yeah, so these armed forces would protect whatever the surplus that the first societies created. So the state is there's different kind of states, and the state always depends on whatever the material realities. This is kind of like where historical materialism comes in, that Marx and Engels in their studies of the origin of state. Engels, the family state, and blanking on the name of that book, but that's a good book that kind of go over these concepts quite well. And yeah, we're mostly going to focus on how the bourgeois state, and how the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, how they continue to exploit the working class and the surplus that the working class makes. Yeah, so to go over into a definition of bourgeois democracy. So bourgeois democracy into appeared through many different kind of bourgeois revolutions, whether this was the French Revolution, the English Revolution, or the American Revolution. So there was the bourgeoisie in the beginning, coming out of out of the feudal societies, presented itself as a progressive social class, going against the bulwark of all the feudalism, kings and monarchy, all those other things, which the kings and these feudal societies are very strict authoritarian governments, which later we'll go over that, how they're in some ways very similar to fascist states. So one of the gains of the bourgeois democratic revolutions were the national constitution and legislative assemblies, including conventions, clubs, and one of the more popular ones was the Jacobins, the Jacobin French Revolution, and this and here it kind of goes over, like, this was during the King Louis the 16, and many of these famous figures, Danton, Robespierre, during the Jacobin uprising or revolution period. So yeah, and a lot of this terminology comes out of the French Revolution. So to say that a government is democratic, it doesn't mean that it can be violent. This is something that Marx and Engels, for them, the state itself is a very violent institution, and it's more of an organized violence. And in this case, in the bourgeois democracy, it's organized violence from the ruling class against the exploiting class. Oh, what are some messages here? Okay. All right. So democracy is distinguished from all other regimes of bourgeois domination because it guarantees certain formal freedoms to all. So these freedoms are like the right of assembly, of expression, of free demonstration, of free association, the guarantee to a fair trial, broad defense. But we say these are a formal guarantee because usually in a bourgeois democracy, there's unequal conditions between the different classes, between the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, the petty bourgeoisie. So many of these freedoms that we have are not really, we're not really, almost impossible to achieve them, as those of us when we think of U.S. bourgeois democracy. Um, so one characteristic of the bourgeois democracy is the tripartite powers. So we see this in the U.S. and in other bourgeois democracies where you have the executive, the president, you have the legislative, the Congress, and the Senate, and the judicial, the Supreme Court. So this kind of a three-way division allows the bourgeoisie to the various sectors of the bourgeoisie, whether the industrial, the finance capital, allows them to checks and balances amongst themselves to see who's in control. And yeah, another important aspect of bourgeois democracy is the ability to eligibility of representatives and rulers. So elections more or less. So the election of judges, delegates to the party, things like that. Yeah, so more stuff here on bourgeois democracy. So I'm going to mostly focus on fascism, but the reason this first parts of the article kind of go over into these definitions is because it'll help clarify why fascism is a particular regime. So so we already went over the bourgeois democracy. There's different forms, different contents it can take. Some of the advantages of this are that it allows the various bourgeois sectors. So whether it's like the bourgeoisie that owns this a lot of the raw materials, like steel, coal, oil, or there's and today we have the tech companies there. So it allows these different sectors to kind of figure out how they can manage, how they can co-opt different sectors of the middle classes, of the working classes. So it allows them kind of to manage and have a more stable society. So there's like within a bourgeois democracy, there's all these elected officials, and there's a bureaucracy that's created out of this, and there's like millions, out of this like state bureaucracy, there's millions of officials. We can kind of when you look at the U.S. and the composition of this class, it's it's huge. I've seen numbers of like 20-30% are one way or another, or they're hired by the government or so. And yeah, another big part to big aspect to think about is the concept of the correlation of forces. So this means that the bourgeoisie will impose a certain kind of regime depending on the correlation of forces, meaning like how much power does the working class and its parties, organizations, the movement has, or the various oppressed communities, the black community, the indigenous communities, all these different, like how much organizational power they have. So when you look at the U.S. Bourgeois democracy, the kind of government regime they impose, it always depends on this. So like in one period, Democratic Party is better, another period, a Republican Party is better, and within there's a variation. Sometimes they want a more, you have FDR, a more quote unquote progressive Democratic Party. So another important regime to think about that will help us clarify this regime is Bonapartism. So this is a regime named after Napoleon the First. So in Bonapartism, which we think of this French example, there's in a Bonapartist regime you can have elections, you can have plebiscites, elected bodies. However, this is kind of seen as a form. In this kind of regime, you can have this. It really bases itself on the standing army. So Napoleon the First, he comes out of the army, and his regime is really based on the figure of Napoleon, and he imposes himself through the army. So many of these democratic freedoms that came out of the French Revolution in the 1700s were during this regime in the 1800s were taken away. So this regime got rid of they closed down all the newspapers they arrested many opponents, people that opposed them. They persecuted any dissidents. So there's no exercise of freedom, expression, things like that. So in some ways it's we'll go into later, but very similar to a fascist regime. Another regime to think about is Bonapartism sui generis. We saw this in governments of like Mexico, Cardenas in the early 1900s, Nasser in Egypt, Perón in Argentina, Chavez, more recent one. And in this kind of regime, it's similar to the other one where like it's really based on the military armed forces. However, there's certain concessions given. And usually this kind of happens in more semi-colonial countries, meaning Latin America or the Middle East, Egypt. And there's certain concessions given. For example, for Cardenas in the early 1900s, Cardenas nationalized the oil industry. He created a board of directors that had, co-opted various unions. In Argentina, Perón created legislation to protect many rights of unions. And even there's a story that, Perón would go to union hall and he would drink mate, which is like, it's a tea, it's a kind of a tea. So, he tried to, that's just how Peronism, even to today, has so much influence because many workers see them, have a lot of faith in Peronism. And now it's like, you have Kirchnerism. And, there's also, you have military dictatorships. Latin America has a huge history of military dictatorships, meaning, they're based institutions of the Navy, Army, Aeronautics. And then you also have another regime, which isn't you don't see it as much, but you have the theocracy, which, in Iran, or the absolutist government of Saudi Arabia. So, these are similar to, they're very authoritarian regimes, more based on more, religion. So now we're going to go to fascism. So now that we've go over to these categories of, regimes, governments, different kinds, so what is fascism? So here I have an image of, Trotsky. I think, many of us, Trotsky, yes, I think wrote one of the best written, expositions on fascism. He was writing this during the rise of fascism. And he also based a lot of his ideas on the Kornilov coup attempt in 1917. Like this, Kornilov was a general in Russia, and he was being sent by the Russian aristocracy to try to kick back the Bolsheviks, and he was going to likely impose a fascist regime. And I'm not going to go too much into the details of that, but the Bolsheviks, you could say that was probably one of the first possible fascist regimes. But the Bolsheviks were able to beat it back, and thus you get the Russian Revolution in October. So fascism. So it's a bourgeois regime still, but it's different. It's very different from the other ones we've talked about. So fascism relies on a great leader, Hitler, for example, in a similar way to Bonapartism, which explains sometimes why there's confusion between those two regimes. There's a deep police dictatorship, or slash military police dictatorship. And fascism relies on an ideology that reinforces pre-existing oppressions in society. In Germany, you saw, anti-Semitism, but it could be, nationality, it could be racial, it could be gender, it could be sexual oppression, and it attacks democratic freedoms. But fascism differs from the other regimes mentioned in important aspects. So one important difference is that fascism is a result of a general crisis that is installed in society. A crisis, usually in economic origin, but that's also political and social, that rises to try to overthrow the bourgeois regime. So it's necessary for the majority of the bourgeoisie to believe that they're in imminent danger, and that someone's trying to destroy them, for them to choose this kind of regime. So another second important factor is the fascism is a result of the inability of the proletariat to lead and present itself out of this crisis. So fascism usually arises also as a response to the petty bourgeoisie. So petty bourgeoisie, we're talking about small business owners, some of the more or like small farm owners that own bigger plots of land, or some of the more higher paid white collar classes, like government workers, things like that. So yeah, usually when the petty bourgeoisie loses its faith on the working class to seize power, that's this kind of creates a national crisis. So number 3, so fascism is a mass movement. So it has to involve millions of people, like I mentioned, usually petty bourgeoisie, that were ruined by this economic crisis. So that's what happened in 1929 in Germany. And they're afraid of being ruined. And also the lumpen proletariat. So the lumpen proletariat they're part of the working class. They're considered some of the lower stratum that's been declassed because of this socioeconomic crisis, and usually includes like vagrants, criminal elements, some of the black market. But this definition is also up for debate, but I'll go with that. And these usually fascism has used these two classes to physically attack the proletariat even before the seizure of power. So you look at the German fascism, we see a powerful mass movement that's organized and also militarily organized. So the brown shirts in Germany, for example, organized more than 4.5 million people. So fascism is above all an extra parliamentary movement, meaning it tries to initially ignore the parliamentary, and meaning it uses illegal methods before it seizes power, and because it tries to confront a mass movement of working class. Another fourth feature is in the process of development towards the seizure of power, but also after achieving the goal, fascism has the objective of waging civil war without truces until all organizations of all kinds that the working class may have are destroyed. So the intention is just to destroy, all kinds of working class parties, its unions, its clubs, its football / soccer teams, schools, all the institutions of working class. So this is where it's different from the other regimes we already mentioned, Bonapartism, sui generis, bourgeois democratic regime, because they're in these other regimes try to co-opt these working class institutions that's needed for the stability of that. So that's another key difference. So it thus becomes necessary to involve whole social sectors. So this is why the petty bourgeoisie are brought in, the lumpen proletariat. There's the bourgeoisie uses these forces to be its foot soldiers, and foot soldiers to fight against working class. And so once fascism becomes in power, like in Germany, Italy, it tries to adapt itself to the bourgeois state, create laws, things like that. But also the state adapts to it as well. So like we said in Germany and Italy, major purges were necessary to impose a fascist regime, meaning major purges of the government. So they purged a lot of the previous liberal or other conservative bourgeoisie. So yeah, this very important characteristic fascism of it being a mass movement. At the same time, and also the bourgeoisie also, it gets scared of it because it starts realizing it doesn't have this control it has, even though it kind of used them. So this is why the bourgeoisie always, in historical cases, fascism has been a last resort. It's they realize they don't want to create their own doing, which in Germany and Italy, like they did purge a lot of the more liberal bourgeoisie. So that's kind of what happened to them. So yeah, the fascism, they attack liberals and bourgeois conservatives. For them, anyone who's their opponents, they'll be attacked. Even the more the democratic bourgeoisie. Yes. So let's see. So yeah, so after the fascist regime destroys all these work organizations, they do that because it also allows them to exploit the working class even more. So this, like we saw in these other cases, wages are frozen, many of the benefits of the working class were frozen, and this also leads the fascist state to put more into more forces, put more resources into the creation of weapons. This is why, like in the case of Germany and Italy, these regimes started buying a lot, even and arming itself even more. And in this case, due to that, the arms bourgeoisie gained from this. So yeah, so fascism. So the fight against fascism. So let's see. The liberals and conservatives were, when they first see the Nazis and fascists, they see it this rampaging mob, and they think they can kind of control it. And so that's why they'll use. Well, this is before the fascists take power and control. They'll use riot troops. They'll use the police. They'll use whatever armed forces to doing that. So like in the case of Germany, the Social Democrats, they believed that they were, at first they thought they could negotiate with the Nazi Party. They thought they could live with them. But as we saw historically, this became their undoing. Because what ended up happening is that the fascists ended up attacking the Social Democrats, and when it came to that time. Yeah, we also see the Third International. Like, so we talked about Social Democrats. So the Third International, this would be the Third International especially after Stalin, and after Stalin kicks out Trotsky and starts kind of creating his home bloc. They had incorrect characterizations. Like, this is something that Trotsky in his book, what it is, he really goes into it quite well. But also, like, there were also other people kind of had characteristics of fascism. So Clara Zetkin, here on the picture of that. I actually read it recently, and it gives some good. Like, Trotsky based a lot of his German analysis on some of Zetkin's analysis, but there's some limitations. Like, when I read it over, that it kind of tends to be a bit soft on Stalinism. Like, and also, like, I haven't read Togliatti or Gramsci, but in this article, they have some critiques of that. But it's still, I think, solid stuff. So during the period of 1928 to 1933, the Communist International, and at this point, Trotsky, characterizes it a very bureaucratic centrist regime, international. The Comintern starts saying they start saying that everything is fascism. So they start calling Social Democrats fascists, social fascists. So in this way, you kind of see some parallels to today when you have when you have the certain reformists and liberals calling started characterizing Trump as a fascist. Like, at least I think there's kind of a parallels, because some confusion on the terminology. So yeah, but starting in 1933, after Hitler's victory in Germany, the Comintern, they make a 180-degree turn, and then this is when they start creating the Popular fronts. So this is when they start making fronts with the more liberal bourgeoisie to fight fascism. So they make a turn, 180 turn. So Popular Front is you're creating electoral fronts usually with the progressive bourgeoisie. This is when the Stalinists started doing that. So that's for today, that helps explain a lot of the reformist politics of the bourgeois, of the Stalinists, but also the Social Democrats. So, like I mentioned earlier, Trotsky's text, I think, is one of the best texts. Like, in terms of, I've read it a couple of times recently, and it just, it still blows my mind how it's a good understanding of what to do with fascism. So in his works, like when he talks about the German situation, he talks about the situation in France. So for a period in France, there was actually there was a fascist regime in the early 1930s, and also in Spain with Franco. So in these cases, he demonstrates what fascism is, what it entails, and he goes over the errors of Stalinism. Earlier I explained, like, kind of this popular frontism or the ultra left period of the Germany. And during this ultra left period of Stalinism, they refused to form the united front with the Social Democrats. So if you read this text, you'll realize how the Social Democratic Party was a really huge party of tens of millions, and but also the German Communist Party was also a very big party. Like, you had a couple millions during its peak. So even during like Trotsky would argue in this text that if the Social Democrats and the German Communist Party, the Stalinists, if they formed a united front, they created a coalition together along with their unions, because they all led the biggest unions. They could have militarily defeated the Nazis. Like, that was theoretically possible, but they were too sectarian to do that. So Trotsky proposes and when it comes to fighting fascism, the importance of defending these existing elements of workers' democracy within the bourgeois democracy. So this is defending the democratic freedoms, even if they're formal. And also, it all means defending workers' newspapers, its buildings, its meeting places, its parties, being able to do demonstrations and the meetings themselves. So it becomes a big part of fighting fascism. And Trotsky, he says, this can't be done by you can't rely on the police or the bourgeois state to disarm or stop fascism. It's up to the working class to do this. So because in many cases, the police can take away arms from the fascists, but the fascists, they have the support of the bourgeoisie, so they can just get some more. Um, so yeah, it's important to defend the democratic rights of the proletariat. Um, so yeah, this is one of the big core aspects of the Workers' United Front against fascism. The United Front itself was really born in the fight against fascism. Like if you really study its origin. Um, so yeah, so more on the United Front against fascism. So Trotsky says it's impossible to form a Workers' United Front with reformism with the aim of taking power. The essence of reformism is precisely its fight against the revolution within the working class. Reformism doesn't want a socialist revolution. But however, to the extent that fascism threatens the material and physical existence of reformist leadership, the awareness of the real danger of fascism arises, especially at the base, but also in leading sectors of reformism. So on the one hand, a united front, there's a policy of calling on the leadership of the reformist organizations to do actions together, but also, the other more important part is also to bring in the rank and file of the reformist organizations. This really will, brings the united front into reality. And part of the goal is to divide the leadership from the rank and file of reformism. Trotsky says special attention must also be paid to the petty bourgeoisie. So, even though the petty bourgeoisie, they can't have a petty bourgeoisie state or government, um, it's still fundamental to, if you don't win over the petty bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie wins them over. So this is why it's very important for any socialist revolution or any fight against for the United Front against fascism to bring in the petty bourgeoisie, like of course, through the leadership of the working class. So the petty bourgeoisie is a very unequal class. Its mentality and way of life is closer to the bourgeoisie, especially in its upper strata. But in some of the lower stratas of the petty bourgeoisie, the material and psychological conditions are more similar to the proletariat. All right, so more on the United Front. So again, the bourgeoisie cannot be a reliable ally in the fight against fascism. So it's something Trotsky is very clear about. However, he says in special situations, there can be certain agreements, certain unity in action with the bourgeoisie. For example, meaning you never form a united front with the bourgeoisie, but you can do, you can do certain unity in action with them, meaning like common demonstrations with them. When it comes to defending certain democratic freedoms, like maybe defending a certain law that that socialist thinks is important. But these are these are specific cases, and again, no united front with the bourgeoisie. And again, Trotsky says, we can't rely on elections. The elections are not enough to defeat fascism. And yeah, we're coming to our conclusion. Hopefully, let me know I'm not too much over time. So again, what are some of the things we can learn from the study of fascism? So as much as we can, hate some of these like aforementioned right-wing regime and governments, we earlier was talking about some of the more right-wing bourgeois democratic regimes, Bonapartism sui generis. As much as we can, hate on them, we can't just start, calling these kind of regimes fascism. Like, as like for example, Trump. We can hate the Trump regime as much as we want, but calling it fascist, it doesn't give the Marxist category. It just is not the best way to do it. So yeah, defining any enemy that is more to the right as belonging to the phenomenon of fascism, maybe mere ignorance, which is already wrong. But the problem with this, it can be serve as a justification for a number of policies. So like if we had started defining the Trump regime as fascist, then that would mean we would start changing our strategy. So in another big problems of calling right-wing governments fascist is that a lot of them more reformist socialists or liberals are going to start calling for a popular front, meaning forming a front with the progressive bourgeoisie, quote unquote. So this is kind of where that policy kind of lead to that, which you look at what's happening in Brazil with Bolsonaro. That's what some of the socialists are saying, like, oh, Bolsonaro is a fascist. We need to form a front with the PT, the Workers' Party, which is more of at this point more of a bourgeois party, and we need to fight them. Like, forget about socialism. So that's just, and um, that's kind of the dangers of just of using this fascism. And just to end again, so the only social force of capable of stopping a real fascist threat is a proletariat. Um, yeah, and this is why the big gist of our strategy in the United Front is the working class must be the leadership. Like, we can win over the middle classes, the petty bourgeoisie, but they must be at the end of the day, the working class has to be the leadership. Yeah, so this is the end of my presentation. Hopefully it gets people enough time to talk more about these things. So I'll stop the sharing here.